All right, we are streaming live. Welcome, welcome to the Tillmans, all of them. My name is Timothy Gager, and this is Virtual Fridays Dire Literary Series on a Thursday, just to confuse everybody. This is actually a good test run because I'm considering moving the series to Thursdays starting January 2023. So hopefully that will work out well. My very special guest tonight is Aaron Tillman. And let me show you a little bit about Aaron here. If you really want to know Aaron Tillman, his website is Aaron Tillman, one word.com. And you can find out about his books and his events. And just to, oh, wait, where am I? We're not here. Okay. I thought that would be a good, segment.
Clearly, yeah, that I meant to update things. That's a good nudge for sure. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I like to make my guests feel comfortable, like doing stuff like that. You get all the interviews, you get the events, you get books, and you can go home. Who says you can't go home again? But it's my very special pleasure to introduce writer, short story writer, and academic professor, correct?
Yeah, of sorts. Yeah, I'm at UMass Amherst, and I teach out of the writing program. So,
all right, so we'll talk about that later. But without anything else from me, let's turn it over to Aaron, and Aaron will be, I believe, sharing from his book, Consolation Miracles.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, here's the book, although I may read from my screen. But thanks so much, Tim. I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and it's an amazing series. And I know my earlier collection, I had an opportunity to do it live, or this is live, but in person pre-pandemic. So I'm grateful to join this group now. And I am going to, read a couple of short pieces. I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll start. So this is, again, a Consolation Miracles is a most recent collection, came out earlier this year. And it's primarily from Gateway Literary Press, I should say. And it's, they had, some of you may know Gateway Literary Review, and they specialize in sort of magical realist short fiction and into the surreal and weird, they like to say. So they just started a press, and they put out a couple of books. Mine was among the first two, and now they have a couple more coming out soon. So I'm going to read a couple of stories from this collection of short stories, Consolation Miracles. I'll start with the very first story in the collection. It's called When the Books Turned into Butterflies. So I think timing-wise, this should work out pretty well. So, pardon me. Thank you again. And here is When the Books Turned into Butterflies. The shelves had been creaking for days, but no one got close enough to hear them. When they started to shudder, I was the only one who noticed. Franny's old picture board books were the first to take flight, sprouting wide, textured wings and flapping off the top shelf. I watched the red rug in the great green room stretch into fore and hind wings, yellow letters merging into a bowling pin body, head made of moon with orange antenna angling between the blinds and out the window. The books from my parents' college shelves flew in unpredictable directions. There were those that huddled together by the wall, flapping like sisters before taking flight, and one that seemed to descend from the ceiling in what looked like a blaze of fire. Others refused to move at all. I watched the row of travel guides and reference books and encyclopedias stretching into paper-thin wings, plotting their courses across the room and into the open world. It wasn't until the cookbooks started to rise that I was compelled to move. Mom hadn't used the cookbooks in years, but there was a time when I was a little older than Franny is now that we used to comb through the pages together. I remember we made marzipan cookies once, mixing butter and sugar and flour and almond paste. We rolled and squeezed and pinched the batter into circles and droopy stars, placing them on sheets to bake. I could still feel the heat on my cheeks as I watched them through the oven door. From the words that I couldn't even read yet, we had created something real, something we could taste. It was the taste of that day that drew me across the worn floor of the study where I lunged after an eggplant wing, my fingers nipping the smoky edge before it flapped away from my hand and into the belly of the sky. As others fled the room and more books began to stir on the shelves, I ran to the window and pulled the screen down. I was stopping the others from leaving, but creating a whole new problem. I first saw the books twitch a few days before. I'd heard the soft squeaking from down the hall and crept my way to the study, the room that Mom had always kept closed. When I peeked my head inside, an arm of sunlight was reaching through the open window. There was a thick, musty smell, but also a cool breeze. I remember Mom saying she wanted to air the room out, but I guess she hadn't done too much more than that. I stepped over the braided oval rug, the knots poking into my bare feet, and stopped at the grainy oak desk, standing in the wedge of a shadow. That's when I saw the shelf twitch. The books in the top row seemed to be vibrating. Dust was sprinkling onto the hardwood floor. My mouth fell open, but I couldn't take a breath. I had to tell Mom. I tracked her down in the dining room where she was pacing in conversation with a client. She kept waving me away until I made myself too much of a distraction to ignore. "For Christ's sake, sweetie, what?" she said with the phone on her stomach. I told her what I had seen. "The dust was dropping to the floor and jumping up in a spray of light," I said, trying to make it something she could see, something she had to see. "You were dreaming, honey." "But it's daytime," I reminded her. "I was awake." "I thought I told you to stay out of that bloody room. All your father's old shit in there. Where's Franny?" she said, unwilling to give this any more of her time. "I thought I told you to watch Franny." "He's in his spot," I replied, though I really hadn't been watching and wasn't entirely sure. When I stepped into the living room and pointed to the space beneath the glass end table, there he was, stabbing his finger into the screen of his blue rubber-encased tablet, occasionally swiping a violent hand across the glass to trigger a new set of pictures to puncture an attack. "Just make sure he doesn't break anything." "But what about the books?" I said. But Mom had already spun back to the dining room, her thumbs in a rapid dance on her phone. After I had lowered the window screen, the study started filling up, the light flickering beyond the flap of anxious wings. There were butterflies swirling in patterns by the ceiling, casting a roiling glow against the walls, a spectrum of horror and beauty, and others on divergent courses, darting between the door and the wall, appearing crazed and creating a chaotic vibration that I felt in my chest. As the books continued to turn, images forming beneath the skins of the covers, a continuous course rising off the shelves, the space in the study seemed to shrink. I was on the verge of panic when the door creaked open and Franny toddled in, his eyes the size of his belly and cheeks. He dropped his tablet to the floor. I pulled him in and shut the door. Franny's head was shifting in all directions, watching with awe and delight at the colorful swaths of butterflies that moved throughout the room. A creamy yellow butterfly with violet eyes in the belly of its wings flew up to Franny, hovering beside his shoulder. They stared at each other, Franny nodding as if in silent conversation. But when he turned back to the chaotic swarm, Franny began to fidget, tugging at the soft skin beneath his elbow. Then the grunting. He picked up his tablet and pulled at the door. The violet-eyed butterfly followed him into the hall. I tried to wave it back in, but when the others started veering toward the door, I had to slam it shut. The patter of Franny's feet as he moved away from the study mixed with the chorus of flapping wings. Moments later, I heard my mom shriek, then the slap of her shoe against the wall and the squelch of a butterfly's body bursting. I felt it in my gut. The room became frantic. I heard Franny start to cry. I ran to the window and opened the screen wide. The closest butterfly filed outside. Others seemed to battle with the breeze, weaving and bobbing and arcing around the window. "Go," I pleaded, hoping the room might empty as fast as it had filled up, but I had no real control. The room was still alive with butterflies. The bookshelves were bare except for one book, the Atlas, weighted to the bottom shelf, too heavy to move. I walked to the desk and slumped to the floor. That's when the Atlas fell, its wide frame smacking the edge of the wooden shelf, the book sliding to the floor. Covers sprayed open, belly exposed to the light. The pages inside were stirring, countless beating pockets, fluttering independently. all a part of a single body, wings stretching as wide as the window. I crawled over to take a closer look. Reaching out to touch one of the wings, I felt the pull of each eddy and found myself drawn into the center, into the spine. I could feel the hum and buzz in my fingers and in my legs. It was surging through me. I was surging through it, fusing with the body of this enormous butterfly. We rose from the wooden floor into the air of the study, taking a slow, labored flight toward the window. I heard Franny crying and Mom's heavy step in the hallway. With a flap that sounded like a flag in the wind, we lit outside, hovering over the sidewalk and street. I was flooded with fear and adrenaline. We turned back to the window just as the study door opened. Franny and Mom were standing beneath the threshold, staring through a screen of butterflies. "Get down from there," I saw Mom mouth as we edged away from our building. Angled against the grain of the wind, we poured over pages of sky, air stinging our eyes, raising the hairs and the flesh of our wings. Thanks. So that's that story. When the books turned into butterflies, I was thinking time-wise, I could read one shorter piece, even shorter, if that's all right. Does that work time-wise?
Yeah, I do want to have some time to talk to you. So read something if it's real short.
Yeah, it's like a page and a half. We'll do
do it.
Okay, great. So that'll be, so when the books turned into butterflies is the first story in part 1 of Consolation Miracles, and the story that I am about to read is the final story in the first part of the collection. So I'm just going to get there, and a lot of these stories were written, well, they were written at different times, but a bulk of them were written during the pre-vaccination days of the pandemic, and there was some isolation and fear and sadness and things like that. So this had some of that in mind, but still with the magical pieces. So this is called Her Eyes Misted Music. Mom said she could feel the notes on her skin, a cascade of scales running over her arms. My sister and I were not allowed inside the room, but we could see Mom through the window and we could hear her clearly enough. During the initial days in the hospital, she had been too weak to talk, and when she did, it was barely above a whisper. But once the music arrived, her voice began to boom. We could have fooled ourselves into thinking that she was recovering, but there was something unhinged about her tone, something dissonant. My sister and I didn't say it aloud, but I think we both knew it was a final surge, a last gasp. All we acknowledged at the time was gratitude that we could hear her, especially since she had so much to say. But she only talked about the music, the spirit who projected notes into the air. When the sun shone through, it made a rainbow chime. Mom said her eyelashes were made of silk, and when she fluttered them with enough force, they would hum. She had nylon strings for hair, which she would tighten and strum at night to help Mom sleep, or pluck during the day as the two of them gazed outside at the swaying trees. The spirit's stomach was a tambourine, and when she moved, Mom could hear the rhythmic rattling. Her ears were finger cymbals, but she preferred to call them zills, and they crashed when the world grew too volatile. Her lips were the bands of a jaw harp, which she played by flicking her tongue, and her knees were knockers that she would hit with the mallets of her fingers. Her heels were clogs, of course, and she could click and clop over the hospital floor when the doctors and nurses were out of the room. We never saw the spirit until Mom's final moments, when her time on earth had nearly come to an end. We were watching through the window. Mom hadn't stirred for hours. Her eyes were sinking into the manholes of her skull, her dusty hair receding into the threads of her starched white pillow. Her thin bark of gown seemed to hover over oniony skin. The blanket was pulled so tight across her waist, tucked in severe corners, I could barely breathe when I looked at it. Then the solitary toll from one of the monitors triggered a rush of hospital personnel. Standing helplessly outside the room, unable to comfort our mom, my sister and I held each other. The voices and beeps and squealing machines began to whirl. It was dizzying and devastating, and I was drowning in the pools of my tears, my eyes, sorry. But then my sister calmed me down, said the sounds were starting to harmonize, said she could see them. She urged me to look in the room. Mom was moving again, reaching her hand toward the window where we stood, the xylophone bones of her knuckles projecting to the sky. She turned her wrists so her palm was exposed, her fingers like flattened kalimba keys. Then I saw the spirit. She had taken Mom's hand and was stroking the ends of her fingers with her crystalline thumb, making a soft melody that resonated throughout the room. Extending her other arm, she reached through the window. We clasped our hands around the music, which muffled for a moment and then rose, wailing out of my sister and me. Our own crushing harmony, a song to release the sorrow and joy inside us. All right, thank you, and sorry about that. Maybe that was too much of a bummer to end on. And,
Oh no, that's great stuff, and thank you so much. So I've got a few questions for you. In real life, do you think this way? Like if you're driving down the street, does your mind go to this magical type of place?
Yeah, I don't, sometimes I think in that there's some useful sort of metaphorical potential for a lot of magical pieces, and that you could imagine things, and whether it's conversations that you might have with yourself, and then in a story you can imagine the presence of that person, or there's something that I think I tend to imagine things in as being more tactile than they might really be. So I think there's some element of the magical in that, giving something presence. And I'm interested in the way authors have dealt with that kind of thing. So there's Amy Bender is a writer that many probably know. I think of her, she has a story called Ironhead. And the premise kind of sounds ridiculous, but it's a sensitive boy with an iron for a head, and he was raised by pumpkin-headed parents. But what's communicated in this story, which is very grounded in real life circumstances, is sort of the weight of his difference in isolation. And it turns out to be a pretty crushing and beautiful story. And to imagine the weight of difference as a huge iron for someone's head is something that I've always appreciated. So I think I'm influenced, at least the lens through which I'm looking at things is influenced by writers like her. She's a pretty brilliant writer, though.
In this world of modern writing, do you feel that writers have to go to these extreme places?
Extreme being sort of a magical or fantastical place, or
magical, fantastical, or over the top in other ways?
I don't think so, but the world has become pretty absurd, right? A lot of things that I look at a lot of things through the realm of humor, I think, and I can thank my parents and my brother for that, which is the majority of this Zoom room here. But I think of satire and how that has, as exaggerated. One of the key tools of satire is exaggeration to kind of convey a point, and somehow the reality has become, almost more absurd than a lot of satire. So, and maybe the magical works in a similar way, that it helps to, you can make you could push something to an extreme that helps people see it or understand it or recognize something that they might not otherwise have. But no, I think there's room for very realistic fiction, and obviously nonfiction should be realistic, and poetry and art. And I don't think it has to, but maybe it's just an easier out for people like me who can't conjure things in more realistic ways. Some of my limitations, maybe. Although I certainly have stories that are more grounded in realism. I have another collection that I'm finishing now that doesn't have any of the magical stuff in it. So I kind of put it all in Consolation Miracles.
Well, even in the stories you read tonight, especially I was thinking about books turning into butterflies, it starts out very straight in order to set the scene, set the place of the story. When you're writing a story like that, where is your general plot line? Do you lead it astray?
Yeah, sometimes I just follow, it's leading me to some degree. Almost every story, it's sort of an easy out, but has a different way of coming, being realized. And in that particular story, when the books turned into butterflies, my eldest daughter was drawing wings on books one day. And I just said, oh, that's interesting. And then I thought of the way book, you kind of get transported by reading and books. And I thought of that relationship. And then I tried to figure out a circumstance where the books might be isolated themselves. And that's where within that story, although it's about this person sort of escaping within, and this book, there's it seems like the parents are divorced, and there's some parental neglect, and the younger sibling is just engrossed in technology almost as a babysitter. So there's a couple of real things that I thought they seem to be on the periphery of that story, but in many ways I see them as central to the final escape out the window.
Well, the way you described seeing your daughter drawing wings on a book, do you get most of your ideas visually?
They really vary. It's funny because I was just thinking about this earlier today. Sometimes it is a visual, but oftentimes it's a line, it's a voice. It could, like, one of the stories in Consolation Miracles is called Believing the Attic. And and it opens with just a line, I don't believe in umbrellas. And I think I overheard someone say that, and I was trying to figure out, like, who would say that? I don't believe in umbrellas. And I was trying, and
somebody in Umbrella Academy would say
yeah, that. Exactly. Maybe, or somebody works for a raincoat company. I'm trying to figure that out. But and so sometimes it's that voice, and there are some stories that are a little bit more voice driven. I have a story that's not in this collection that really had, Cortland's a bullshit apple. And I kept saying that. I don't know. I think it came to my head as I was walking in the supermarket, and I saw someone like, fingering a Cortland apple. And I'm sure I have nothing against Cortland apples. I'm sure they're wonderful, but I was in a surly mood, and I just said, Cortland's a bullshit apple. And I kept thinking, well, who would actually say that? What would be the circumstances? So I had that in my head. And sometimes it is just that voice, or sometimes it's an image, and sometimes it's a concept. I want to realize something that, like, I have almost the ending in mind, and I have to figure out how to get there and portray it. So no consistency. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean, I think delicious apples are a satire, but they're not all that delicious.
No, they're not. No, not all delicious.
In general, I feel the length of short stories has decreased from the time of the classic short story writer of the 50s and the 60s. So where is your sweet spot in terms of page length or word count for your short stories?
I have like almost an unpublishable sweet spot. It tends to be, for me, although Consolation Miracles is kind of the exception. It's comprised of a lot of shorter stories with maybe 2 exceptions, but for whatever reason, I can't stop writing the 10,000 word short story. I try not to, and I have a lot of them that so my current, the collection that I'm sort of finishing up right now is is 6 stories. That's about 160 pages, 6 stories. And it seems kind of absurd. They're all, the longer stuff, they're all kind of realistically grounded, and none of the magical piece. So I find myself, I think it has the short story, the challenges with the short story for me are sort of balancing that showing and telling. You want to show enough that people are connected to the characters and the circumstances, but there are certain things that need to be told to provide context. And unless it's a voice-driven story, there should be that balance. And I find that for me to really get the adequate amount of showing, it just takes a lot of narrative space. And so, but that said, so for me, it's either the really long, that 10,000 word, or something like 500 words. They tend to be one extreme or another, and there are exceptions for me. But
so does that mean you have a novel in the work that's 7 10,000 word stories?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a couple of novels, but I haven't duped anyone into publishing them yet. I've tried. So yes, I have I do have some novels, even though I think that they at least the most current one did have a short story start. Like, it had a long short story, it was about 12,000 words, and then I started putting something else together that I realized connected with that. And since nobody was publishing that 12,000 word short story anyway, I sort of pushed them together and found yet another voice, and it became the most recent unpublished novel that I have.
Alex has a question. It says, what is it that triggers the fantastical imagination or story for you? Is it dreams or daydreams? And also, are you inspired by other similar writers, and who would they be?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I'm inspired by a number of different writers. And, I think I find it interesting, specifically the way the magical can be used to, let me back up. I've tried to figure out how it is that I often have an emotional reaction to stories that are not realistically grounded. I mentioned Amy Bender's Ironhead before, and there's something about, and that's from her collection Willful Creatures. She has a number of others, and there's something about her writing and the characters she conjures that I feel, that has a sort of a deep emotional reaction for me. So some of it is in that, and I think I tend to like things that make me feel something or make me laugh, and there are some magical writers. Even Consolation Miracles comes from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And I just thought that line was so funny, Consolation Miracles. And in this case, it was, about this angel who had fallen, from the sky. And there was, many people know the story, but it was kind of put in a chicken coop and was treated as an attraction. And, the Consolation Miracles had already ruined the angel's reputation as part of that. I just thought that idea of a consolation miracle was so funny, and I tried to use it and turn it into something slightly different. And certainly that's Marquez is sort of an easy and obvious influence, and Borges, and there are Cynthia Ozick, a Jewish American writer, and has written about some. Again, a lot of realistic material, has also dabbled into the fantastical pieces. And I find she has a story called Levitation that I think is pretty moving. And, so there's a lot of influences. And I think trying to represent something that's hard to represent, the magical, I think, frees up some different opportunities. And I tend to like that magical realist element. So it's grounded in something real, but there's a magical component. And, it sometimes gives me a challenge that I have to figure out how to make it work, how to make it believable. I think it helps with my storytelling process.
Joseph asks, how much do you develop the plot when you write a longer short story? How much do you develop the plot plan in advance?
That can vary too, but a lot of times I am trying to figure out where it's going and how it got there in a way that's believable. So I do a lot of sort of profiling of characters. So I've got side documents, and sometimes they start in the story, and I'm figuring out a lot of where a character's background and history, and I imagine initially that it's part of the story, and then I realize, oh, it's not. So this stuff, it's beneath the water stuff. If we think about the iceberg theory, what's going to stick up above the waterline, and usually I have about 50% of the iceberg sticking up, and I've got to shrink it down to get just the 10%. And so I end up with a lot of sort of background stuff. But in that process, I kind of figure out where it's going, and I tend to like stories that go somewhere. I mean, I can get wrapped up in the beautifully told story of nothing really is happening occasionally, but I do like, I like an element of plot. So I tend, but not at the expense of character. So I like to kind of meld those things. So I often will think it out and note take and outline and try to determine a direction. So, there's something I'm working on now that really, it was agonizing to me, because I had scenarios that I liked that seemed to work well together. I liked the characters. I thought it was interesting, but I couldn't figure out where I was going. And I don't know if I've completely figured that out, but usually I like to know that once I have something set, that there's a place it's going. And sometimes I just trust the process and hope to end up somewhere. And that's why I end up with 10,000 word stories, because it takes me that long to figure out.
All right, let's wrap it up with this question. I'm a firm believer in genetics. So your father writes, and he's a writer. So tell me, what does your father do well in his writing that has been passed down to you?
Oh, it's a critique. This is great. Well, I mean, both my parents are prolific readers and writers, and my mother's written things, not fiction necessarily, but so I think just to begin with, I knew from a very early age, even though I didn't really heed the advice for a long time, that in order to write, one needs to read. So I think it was later on, after I sort of reluctantly realized that there are things I actually enjoyed. And I've grown up seeing both of my parents reading a lot. And then, there's elements of humor that they've both passed along. And I think that's, there's a family of storytellers, my brother included there too. And often if we're going to tell a story, it should be funny a little bit, even though I kind of screwed that in my second story tonight, not really much humor there. But I think, that always helps. You can even get it very, serious material by using humor, and I've always appreciated that. And and my dad writes a lot, so he certainly a lot of mystery and into some of the fantastical material too. He's got a series of were-leopard novels, which again are impressive. They have action, they have excitement. They're not dull, so I've always appreciated that, and also mystery novels. So there's something they're going in a direction. They all have elements of humor. So, I think it's the reading and the emphasis on humor and a story that will leave a reader satisfied. I can't say I always accomplish that, but
it sounds like you'd be a great publicist for your dad.
We'll see. Yeah.
But was there the sound of a manual typewriter in your house when you were growing up? Because my mom used to write, and I remember it was an old Smith Corona, and just it attracted me to an actual typewriter myself.
Yeah, that sound is not. Well, my mother completed her dissertation when I was young, and I think there was some version of a typewriter in our basement. I don't remember it being. I think we had computers pretty early on. My dad was a math and computer science professor, although maybe a reluctant one. I don't know, but I think he would have preferred to read and write and play bridge or do some other things or watch sports. But he I think he was a talented teacher. But I think computers were a part of our lives. But I do have a memory of that sound, and I appreciate the sound in some fashion, almost like a record. There's a tactile element to the sound, and so I've appreciated that.
Yeah, me too. And in fact, if someone could come up with an app that makes your computer keyboard make that sound as you're typing, they would sell at least one. I mean, I would be the buyer of that. But anyway, Aaron, thank you so much for your appearance and reading the wonderful stories from Consolation Miracles, and your graciousness in answering these questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm grateful, and it not only to be here with the Dyer reading series, but to be with you here. An incredibly talented writer and a really gracious host of these events, and I'm grateful for the opportunity, and it's been fun, and I'm glad to be related to half the Zoom room, which is good.
Yeah, so that's wonderful stuff. I'm going to shut the stream down pretty soon, but if you're watching this on the stream, you want to appear on the open mic, I'll let you in if you use the Zoom link, and we know that you're watching. And next week, we'll be back to a Friday with David Rockland, whom I am reading with on Sunday at his series in Los Angeles. So it's, writers sometimes are like two dogs. I won't even tell you what they're doing, but you know what? It's wonderful stuff. And Aaron, thank you once again.
Thank you, and good luck in Los Angeles. It sounds like an amazing opportunity there too. So, and thank you all for coming. Whether I'm related to you or not, I am truly grateful. And hopefully some people catch it on the live streams and stuff.